The laugh is soft. That is the first thing I notice when I push open the heavy courtroom door and step inside. My stepmother's laugh is controlled. Private. Like she is sharing a joke with herself that she already knows the punchline to. She is sitting at the opposite table with my father on one side and my stepbrother Callum on the other. Their lawyer, a trim man in a charcoal suit, has a yellow legal pad in front of him and a pen in his hand. They look settled, comfortable, like people who have been waiting in a place they have every right to be in. My stepmother doesn't look directly at me. She tilts her chin slightly, the way someone does when they are aware of something without wanting to appear too aware of it. And she laughs. Soft. Controlled. Like she has already watched this story play out and knows exactly how it ends. I keep walking. I have practiced keeping my face still. I have practiced it in my bathroom mirror, in my car, in the waiting room downstairs where I sat for 40 minutes before my lawyer told me it was time. I have practiced it for years, actually, because in my family, showing what you feel has always been used against you. I keep my face still. I walk to my table. My father still hasn't looked at me. That is the second thing I notice. I had braced for eye contact, had thought carefully about what I would do when I looked across the room and saw his face. Whether I would feel grief or anger or the numb tiredness that has replaced both over the last 2 years. I didn't need to prepare. He doesn't look at me. He looks at the table. At the judge's bench at the front, which is still empty. At the wall. At his hands. And then, just once, he shakes his head. Not at me, technically. He doesn't turn toward me. Just a slow side-to-side movement, like a door swinging slightly in a draft. Like someone receiving confirmation of something they already believed. That shake of the head, I know it. I grew up with it. The gesture he made at 12 when I said his girlfriend made me uncomfortable. At 19 when I asked why my mother's jewelry had been moved. The gesture of a man who has decided you are the problem and you're showing up simply proves it. He shakes his head. I sit down. My lawyer, a steady woman named Faye, touches my arm once briefly. I breathe. My stepmother leans forward when I set my folder on the table, a small movement designed to look casual but that lands with purpose. She adjusts her sleeve, picks up her water glass, and tilts slightly in my direction and speaks in a voice that is barely above a murmur. Quiet enough that only I can hear it clearly from where I am, quiet enough that it cannot be objected to. You still think this is yours? 4 words. She doesn't say them with heat. No anger, no raised pitch. She says them the way you say something obvious and slightly sad. The way you speak to someone you find pitiable. I don't answer. I have learned not to answer these things. Not because I don't have a response, I have had 100, but because she doesn't say things like that to hear answers. She says them to land. To settle something into the air. To remind me of the version of this story she has been telling for years. I look at Faye instead. Faye is reviewing her notes. She circles something once with her pen. She is not rattled. That steadies me. I set my hands flat on the table and wait. In the few minutes before the judge enters, I let myself remember what brought me here. Not the legal filings or the 2-year paper trail or the Friday phone call from Faye when she said, carefully, I think we have what we need. Those are the mechanics. I mean the feeling. The one that started the night of my mother's funeral, when my father's girlfriend, who became my stepmother 14 months later, sat in my mother's chair at the kitchen table and said nothing about it. The moment I walked into the courtroom, my stepmother laughed under her breath and my dad shook his head, then. My name is Evelyn Harper. And for the past 8 years, I have been told, in ways loud and quiet and endlessly patient, that my version of the truth does not match everyone else's. That I misremember. That I misunderstand. That I am too emotional to be accurate. I grew up in that. I started to believe it. 3 years ago, I stopped believing it. Not because of a dramatic revelation or because someone finally validated me. Because I found a piece of paper in a box in my mother's old storage unit that said something so plainly and specifically that my memory didn't need defending anymore. I was waiting for today. And today has arrived. My mother died when I was 23. She had been sick for 8 months, sick enough that we knew it was coming, not sick enough that it felt real until it was over. She was 61 years old, specific and funny, and she kept lists of everything. I miss her in a way that I have stopped trying to describe because the description always falls short. She left behind a house. A small investment account. Her jewelry, which had belonged to her own mother before her. A storage unit of things she had been meaning to deal with for years. And a will that she had updated 2 years before she died, when she was healthy, when her mind was sharp and her intentions were clear. The will was specific. I know this because I was there when she signed it. I was sitting in the office of her estate attorney, a methodical woman named Prue who wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck and spoke in the careful tone of someone who has been misquoted before and has decided to prevent it. My mother signed each page. I sat to her left. The notary sat across. It was specific. Then my father remarried. And somehow, specificity became a matter of interpretation. My stepmother Renata arrived in our lives quietly, which I now understand was deliberate. She did not come in with demands or obvious changes. She did not rearrange furniture immediately or throw away my mother's things. She was measured, warm, and had a social intelligence that was genuinely impressive. What she was doing, I understood only later, was learning who my father listened to, which parts of the family history were settled and which were still tender. She was learning what my father wanted to believe about himself and how to speak to exactly that version of him. She never argued with him. She would say something once, gently, and then wait. Gradually the thing she had said became the thing my father believed he had always thought. She was a sculptor that way. Slow, precise, patient, and I was the main thing she was sculpting around. Not attacking me directly, just placing small doubts and small alternate versions of things I had said or remembered. Until my father looked at me with that headshake and I couldn't tell him what had changed. That is the most effective kind of erasure. The kind you don't notice until it's finished. The first thing Renata said that I remember understanding as a lie was about my mother's house. It was maybe 6 months after she and my father married. I had come over for a Sunday dinner. I was still doing that then, still trying to hold onto the version of my father that existed before everything shifted. We were at the kitchen table, which she had recovered in a new fabric, and she said, without any particular emphasis, that my mother had always planned to leave the house to my father in the event that she passed first. I looked at my father. He nodded. That's what she said, he agreed. I was in the room when she revised exactly that assumption, with an attorney, and signed the documents. That's not how I remember it, I said. And Renata tilted her head with this expression of patient concern. Like I was a child misremembering a dream. Grief does things to memory, she said softly. It's okay to be confused. That was the first time she called my accuracy into question. Over the following year, she said it so often and in so many variations that my father stopped looking at me when the subject came up. He just nodded at whatever Renata said. By then the nodding was enough. My father used to ask questions. He was not a perfect man, and I am not building him into something he wasn't. But he was curious. He pushed back on things. He once spent 40 minutes arguing with my mother about whether a particular contractor had actually given them a fair quote, and he was so thorough about it that she finally laughed and told him to just hire someone else. He was not a man who let things slide. And then something happened. I don't know if it was grief or comfort or love or just age, but something happened, and the man who used to ask questions stopped asking them. He stopped correcting Renata when she said inaccurate things. He stopped asking what I remembered. He absorbed her interpretation until it became the shared family truth. The first time I noticed him agreeing with something I knew was wrong, I felt a specific kind of cold. The kind you feel when you realize that the person you thought was on your side was not gone, just quietly, completely, redirected. I kept going to Sunday dinners for almost a year after that. I kept thinking something would shift. It did not shift. It only settled further. The paperwork started appearing about 2 years after the marriage. Not dramatically. Not all at once. A letter here, a notice there. The kind of administrative correspondence that makes your eyes slide over it unless you are specifically trained to read it carefully, or unless someone has already taught you to be suspicious. My mother's investment account, designated for me specifically, had been absorbed into a jointly managed estate account. There was language making this sound reasonable, a simplification, something a good estate manager would do. I called Prue, my mother's estate attorney. There was a long pause. I wasn't consulted on that, she said. I asked what that meant. It means someone else handled it, she said. And then, more carefully, Evelyn, I'd like you to come in. That meeting became the beginning of this hearing. Prue walked me through what had been moved, quietly reclassified, what the will actually said versus what the new documents claimed. She used the word discrepancy twice. The third time she used a different word. I started keeping records that afternoon. Everything. Dates, names, copies of documents, notes from every conversation. I bought a filing cabinet and organized it the way my mother used to, by date, in clear labeled folders. I kept building the file for 2 years. The word that was used most often to describe me during those 2 years was emotional. I heard it directly sometimes. My father. You're taking this very emotionally, Evelyn. That's not helpful. My stepbrother Callum, who had inherited Renata's talent for making unkind things sound neutral. She's just emotional about it. You know how she gets. Mostly I heard it indirectly. Through relatives who called with the careful tone of people who had been briefed. Through my father's old friends who had been told some version of this story and who now spoke to me with a delicate sympathy that made clear they believed the version they had been given. The version where I was grieving too hard and too long. Where I was imagining things. Where my refusal to accept what had happened was the real problem, not what had actually happened. I was difficult. I was confused. I was stuck in grief. I heard it so often that there were months when I wondered if they were right. That is the most insidious thing about that kind of sustained pressure. It doesn't feel like an attack. It feels like maybe you are losing your grip on reality. Like maybe everyone else is seeing something clearly that you can't. I held onto the filing cabinet. I held onto Prue's careful language. I held onto what I knew. By the time I filed the legal challenge, almost everyone in the family had stopped returning my calls promptly. Not all at once. These things never happen all at once. An aunt who used to call every Sunday started texting instead, brief, warm, slightly vague messages that contained no information and asked no real questions. My father's brother, who I had genuinely liked, started responding to my messages a week after I sent them with replies that felt like they had been reviewed by someone before sending. I don't blame most of them. I understand how it works. When one side of a family dispute is louder and more organized and more central to the social structure than the other side, people align with the center because that is where it is safe and comfortable and socially easy. I was not loud. I was organized in a filing cabinet sense, which is different from social. What I had was documentation. What I did not have was the family. I stopped reaching out to people who had been briefed against me, not only out of bitterness, but because those conversations cost me something and gave me nothing. Faye helped. Prue helped. The filing cabinet helped. And I waited for the date of the hearing. Now I am in this room and they are settled and certain, and Callum is leaning back in his chair with the comfortable expression of someone who believes the result is already decided. Callum is 29 and has his mother's quality of performing ease. He came with Renata, a package, the way second marriages often work. He and I were never close, never hostile, just two people orbiting the same difficult situation from different sides. He benefited from what happened, not through malice, but through being on the winning side of a redistribution. He smiles at me now, faintly, from across the aisle. He leans forward and says something to Renata in a low voice. She doesn't respond, but her posture shifts slightly, a small satisfied adjustment, like someone settling into a seat that was made for them. My father still hasn't looked at me. I look around the room instead. It is a smaller courtroom than I expected, wood-paneled walls, a single window on one side, the judge's bench up front behind a raised platform. A court reporter is setting up at a small station to the right. A bailiff stands near the door. It is ordinary, functional, but what is about to happen in it is not ordinary. I open my folder. Faye is already reviewing her opening notes. We are ready. Their lawyer introduces himself to Faye with the smooth confidence of someone who has done this 100 times. He is polished, his suit perfectly fitted, with the practiced handshake of a man whose professional life has been about making confidence feel like competence. He says something to Faye about hoping this can be resolved efficiently. Faye smiles without warmth and says she hopes so too. He goes back to his table and says something that makes Renata nod. My father listens. Callum is now on his phone, typing something, still smiling at whatever he's looking at. Their body language, as a unit, communicates certainty. They have been here before, in the general sense, not in this specific courtroom, but in the space of believing they have control of a narrative. They built this situation. They understand its contours. They have arranged documents and timelines and accounts to support a version of events that, from the outside, looks reasonable and clean. They genuinely believe they win this. I watch them for a moment. I watch the way Renata adjusts her bracelet. The way my father squares his papers. The way Callum puts his phone away and takes a slow, steady breath, reclaiming his composure. They believe it, and that belief has made them careless in specific, documentable ways. That is what Faye is about to show them. The judge enters and everyone stands. She is a woman in her late 50s named the Honorable Petra Vance, and she moves to the bench with the efficient, unhurried pace of someone who is not performing authority but simply has it. She sets her reading glasses on the bridge of her nose. She opens the file in front of her. She looks at both tables briefly. Not warmly, not coldly. With the focused attention of a person who is here to understand something. We are here today regarding the estate challenge filed by Evelyn Harper against the administered estate of the late Miriam Harper, she says. The matter concerns the disposition of property and designated assets under the original will, as well as subsequent modifications made following the decedent's passing. She looks up over her glasses for a moment. I've reviewed the preliminary filings from both parties, she says. I have some questions. We'll hear opening statements first. She looks back down. Renata has her hands folded on the table. My father's posture is straight. Their lawyer uncaps his pen. And I notice something. Renata's hands, folded so neatly, tighten almost imperceptibly on each other. One small squeeze, like someone preparing for something. Not the gesture of someone who has already won. The gesture of someone who is hoping they have. I file that away. Their lawyer stands for the opening statement. He is good at this. I want to be fair and say that clearly, he is good at presenting a version of events in the cleanest, most sympathetic possible frame. He speaks about the difficulty of estate management after a death. About the complexity of financial assets and the reasonable decisions made by a grieving spouse in a challenging time. He uses the word, reasonable, 4 times in 7 minutes. He talks about my mother's intentions, using the phrase, what Miriam would have wanted, as if he knew her, as if he had sat in her kitchen or heard her laugh. He didn't know her. He is describing a simplified version of her that serves his client. I write nothing on my notepad. I just listen. He wraps up by talking about me. He is careful here, careful not to say anything directly unkind, careful to use language that sounds sympathetic while building the picture of a daughter who has struggled with grief, who perhaps misremembers certain conversations, who has found it difficult to accept the natural administrative complexity of settling an estate. He sits down. Renata nods once, a small satisfied motion. Callum exhales slightly. My father looks at the table. Faye stands up. Faye doesn't use a lot of words. That is one of the things I like most about her. She is a precise woman, 40s, no nonsense in the way that comes not from coldness but from efficiency, from genuine respect for the weight of the room. She believes that a courtroom is a place where words have consequences and she treats them accordingly. She says she will be brief. She acknowledges my mother's passing and the complexity of estate administration. Then she says one sentence that changes the temperature of the room. What is not complex, and what will become clear today, is that the documents presented as reflecting the decedent's final wishes do not align with the documents the decedent actually signed, and that this discrepancy is not administrative. It is substantive. Substantive. She lets that word sit. The court reporter types steadily. Then Faye says she intends to present 3 documents. She says she intends to walk through a specific timeline. She says she has one witness whose testimony she believes will be instructive. She sits down. Renata's bracelet clicks quietly against the table. Their lawyer writes something on his legal pad and underlines it. My father finally looks up. But he looks at Renata, not at me. Something in his face has shifted. Very slightly. But I see it. The first crack appears when Faye introduces the timeline. She presents a chronological exhibit, a clear chart showing dates. My mother's will signing, my mother's death, my father's marriage to Renata, each subsequent estate document modification. The date accounts were reclassified. The date the storage unit lease was terminated. She presents it plainly, without drama, like a person laying out items on a table for inventory. Judge Vance reviews it over her reading glasses. Their lawyer raises a mild objection about framing. The judge overrules it without looking up. And I watch Renata. Until now, Renata has been the stillest person in the room. That is her particular skill, the surface composure, the managed presentation. She has been doing it so long it looks natural. But when Faye reaches the date of the storage unit termination, when certain items were disposed of or absorbed without documentation, Renata's smile does something. It doesn't disappear. It changes quality, becomes slightly thinner, more deliberate, like something being maintained rather than something happening naturally. I have been watching her for 8 years. I know the difference. The timeline is not, on its own, the thing that breaks anything. But it is the frame. And once the frame is in place, the picture is impossible to pretend away. Their lawyer is writing faster now. The document Faye introduces next is the one I found in the storage unit. A single page, slightly aged at the corners, in a plain protective sleeve. Faye presents it as Petitioner's Exhibit B, a letter, dated 7 months before my mother died, addressed to Prue. In the letter, my mother states clearly that she does not want the house to pass to her husband in the event of her death. She states her reasoning as clear articulation of intent, references the attached updated will, and requests that Prue keep a copy on file. The letter is in my mother's handwriting. I found it in a box in the storage unit, cleared out 11 months after my mother died. The unit whose contents were managed by Renata. The letter had slipped behind a secondary folder, tucked against the wall of the box. That is why it survived. Faye reads the relevant section aloud. The room is very quiet. Judge Vance writes something. Their lawyer looks at the document and then looks at Renata. Renata looks at the table. That is the moment I have been carrying for 3 years. That single document, in my mother's hand, saying plainly what she intended. Not interpreted, not remembered, written, signed, dated, the truth, sitting in a protective sleeve on a courtroom table. The timeline doesn't match what they presented. That is the second thing Faye walks through, slowly, without elevation, the way you explain something to someone who is paying careful attention. She compares the dates in the respondent's documents with the dates in Exhibit B. She compares statements made in their filings, statements about my mother's verbal intentions, statements about what my mother had told my father she wanted, with the written record. The discrepancies are specific. One document states my mother had expressed her desire for the house to be managed jointly. Exhibit B is dated 4 months before that alleged conversation and contradicts it plainly. Another document states the investment account was reclassified in accordance with the decedent's final instructions. Prue's documentation says the opposite. None of these discrepancies are admitted. They are just presented, timeline against timeline, claim against document. Judge Vance is leaning forward, reviewing papers. Their lawyer asks to approach. He and Faye stand before the judge for 3 minutes. She is still looking at the table. My father has put his hand over his mouth. He does this when he is thinking. He has done it since I was a child. He sits there with his hand over his mouth and he is looking at the exhibit copies in front of him. I know what he is seeing. He is seeing something that doesn't match what he was told. Judge Vance asks my father a question. It is a simple one. She reads a line from one of the respondent's filings, a specific claim about a conversation he allegedly had with my mother regarding her wishes for the house, and she asks him to confirm, in his own words, when that conversation took place. He lowers his hand from his mouth. He looks at Renata, who does not look back at him. He looks at his lawyer, who nods carefully, the nod of someone telling him to speak without being able to tell him what to say. My father opens his mouth. He hesitates. Not long. A few seconds, maybe 5. But in a courtroom, 5 seconds of hesitation before answering a simple factual question is significant. The court reporter's fingers are still above the keys, waiting. He says, "We discussed it more than once. I don't recall exactly when." Judge Vance writes something. "More than once," she repeats, without inflection. "But you can't give me a time frame." "It was an ongoing discussion," he says. Judge Vance makes a note. Renata's jaw is tight. I have learned the sign. She does it when she is recalibrating. When something has moved in a direction she did not plan for and she is deciding what to do. She is deciding, but the judge is already moving on. The shift in the room is not announced. It is not a movie moment, no slammed hands or raised voices. It is something quieter and considerably more significant, the moment the judge's body language changes. She has been upright and attentive throughout. But there is a difference between how someone sits while forming an impression and how they sit when it has formed. Judge Vance is no longer leaning forward. She has settled back. She is looking at the documents with the expression of someone who has assembled a puzzle and is now confirming what she sees. Their lawyer is talking. He is making a clarifying point about the document. He is explaining why the letter, Exhibit B, my mother's handwritten letter, should not be read as a definitive statement of final intent, because subsequent conversations may have updated those intentions. He is saying that verbal expressions of intent are valid and relevant. Judge Vance listens. She asks one question, whether he has any documentation of those subsequent conversations. He says they have the testimony of the surviving spouse. She writes something, not the way you write when convinced, but the way you write when noting an absence. I feel, for the first time in years, like I am in a room where the truth is being heard. Their lawyer begins what I can only describe as a careful retreat. He doesn't announce it. He wouldn't. He is too skilled for that. But what was a confident, linear presentation of facts begins, quietly, to loop back on itself. He clarifies that final instructions referred to general estate directives, not specific written orders. He adjusts the language around the house transfer, explaining that expressed intention captured an ongoing pattern rather than a single documented instance. Each clarification is technically coherent. Each is also, plainly, a walk back. Faye lets him speak. She does not interrupt. She holds her pen lightly and makes one note and then sets the pen down. When he finishes, she asks simply if the respondents are willing to concede that the letter, Exhibit B, is authentic. A pause. Their lawyer confers with Renata for 15 seconds. Renata's voice is too low to hear. But I see her expression. It is the expression of someone who has just realized that the document she did not think existed has been sitting in a courtroom for the last 90 minutes and is not going away. Their lawyer stands. The respondents do not contest the authenticity of the exhibit, he says. Callum stops leaning back. He sits up straight now, his arms on the table, looking at his mother. Renata is looking at the table. Judge Vance speaks for about 8 minutes. She does not raise her voice once. She does not use theatrical language or make declarations that are designed for a dramatic moment. She is a judge, and this is what good judges do, speak clearly, precisely, without more emotion than the situation requires. She reviews the evidence. She notes Exhibit B's authenticity. She notes the discrepancy between the respondent's timeline and the documented chronology. She notes the absence of written documentation for the verbal intentions they cited. She notes my father's inability to confirm a timeframe for the conversations at the center of their claim. She speaks about estate law, the evidentiary standard for written versus verbal intent, and what courts can do with unsubstantiated verbal claims when clear written documentation exists. She says, in plain terms, that the evidence supports the original will as the authentic expression of my mother's final intentions. She says the subsequent estate modifications, those made after my mother's death and without documented legal basis, are not enforceable as replacements for the original will. She gives her ruling. The room is very quiet. Renata does not move. My father has his hand over his mouth again, but this time his eyes are closed. Callum is looking at the floor. I sit very still. I do not smile. There is a version of this moment that involves relief and vindication and the warm flood of finally being seen, and all of those things are present, underneath. But I have spent too long in this fight to feel anything as simple as triumph. What I feel, mostly, is quiet. Not the careful, constructed quiet I have been carrying for years, the quiet of someone holding themselves together in a hostile room. Something different, something that is its own thing. For 8 years I was told what I remembered was inaccurate, that my feelings were disproportionate, that my mother's intentions were not what I knew them to be, that the version of the truth I was carrying was the product of grief and difficulty and perhaps a little irrationality. And now a judge, not a relative, not a friend, not anyone who could be briefed against me, has reviewed the documents and the timelines and the written record and arrived at the same conclusion I arrived at 8 years ago. My mother said what she meant. She wrote it down. She signed it. She gave it to her attorney. And it held. Faye touches my arm again. We're done, she says. I nod. I gather my folder. I stand up. I do not look at Renata. I do not look at my father. I look at the window. Outside in the wide marble corridor, Renata tries to say something. I hear my name said in the voice she uses when reclaiming authority, and I keep walking. Not quickly, not as if I am fleeing. Just walking, steadily, toward the elevator. She says something about this not being finished, about lawyers, about the family. My father says my name too. Just once. I stop. I turn. I look at him. And I think about all the versions of this moment I have rehearsed. All the things I thought I would want to say. I look at him for one long moment. And then I turn back around and I keep walking. Because there are things that don't need to be said in a corridor. The judge said them. The documents said them. My mother said them in her careful handwriting in a letter that survived in a box in a storage unit because it slipped behind a folder. The truth was always there. It was specific and real and signed. It just needed a room where no one could interrupt it. It got that room today. And I walk out into the light.